Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Wharfdale Naturalist, which is the second meeting, I think, in the current winter programme. Nice to see so many of you here. I'm sort of expecting that most of you will already know the drill, that there won't be many people here, although I've no way of telling who don't already know how things work. But I ought to let you know, just in case there are new people attending, that if you have questions that occur to you while you're listening to tonight's talk, it's helpful to Jeff if you're able to write them in the Q&A as the talk progresses, because that will give Jeff time to order them, decide which it makes sense to present first, and so on and so forth. So I hope that's okay. Okay, well, without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker, who is Jim Butterfield. Jim is from not very far away, really, in Barnsley. He was born and educated there. He took an early interest in nature and the countryside, though he says at that stage he wasn't really a dedicated naturalist. But he did enjoy long-distance cycle rides and excursions into Yorkshire and the Peak District. He worked for the Fleet Air Arm Commission, the tractor division of the Ford Motor Company, and was also a researcher with the Dartington Amenity Research Trust. So long and varied career, and he and his wife Greet ended up working as lecturers at Leeds Polytechnic until they retired. Jim is still very active in the U3A. And has been a committed environmentalist, he says, since about the 70s. His talk tonight is entitled Aldo Leopold, His Life, Work and Legacy. And I'm certainly looking forward to finding out a lot more about him. Over to you, Jim.
I'll just share the screen. And here we are. Okay.
Yes. My introduction to the Aldo Leopold, the Sand County Almanac, came more than 50 years ago. And at that time, I left working in industry at Ford Motor Company, and I managed to get an appointment at Dartington as a research officer, looking at recreation management in the countryside and various issues. And in 1968, I was one of a team working on a dune management scheme in North Devon. And my colleague, who later became my wife, recommended that I should read Aldo Leopold, the Sand County Almanac. And we just have a look at the cover of that. And I duly got myself there it is, a copy of the book, and I read it with great enjoyment. I didn't pick up all of the issues with it, but I certainly loved the cover of the spring migration of the geese. And I enjoyed the nature descriptions in the book, and I used some of the tail end of the book where he brings everything together. And I did get some tips there and help that perception should be part of any recreation management. But I would say that if we're going to look at Aldo Leopold, I have one or two snags. The ideal person for this job would be somebody who has visited the Leopold Shack in Wisconsin and who has visited the Southwest United States. And I've done neither of those things, so I'm working second or third hand. However, my wife had in fact had the Sant County Almanac as the set book for her landscape course. And after qualifying as a landscape architect, she worked for the American National Park Service and did visit some of the national parks and areas that Leopold would have been fiddled with. So I'm talking a little bit about third hand in doing with this. And I could say at the start that the publication of the Almanac came a year after Aldo Leopold's death. He died in 1948 of a heart attack, but he was fighting a grass fire in a neighboring farm in the Sant County, Wisconsin. And he had at that time, in preparation, the book that became the Sant County Almanac. It was going to be called Great Possessions. And it was published, having been revisioned by his son, Luna. It was published in the following year and came out and had moderate sales amongst the smaller numbers of people who were engaged with conservation. They respected the arguments, they enjoyed it, but so it stayed until 1968. It was the time that we had published in this country The Limits to Growth, the Blueprint for Survival by the Ecologist. There was a growing environmental movement, both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. And suddenly the Sant County Almanac took off. And in fact, more than 2 million copies were sold. And it was became a very popular and standard work. And I'd like to talk a little bit, before we get on to that, about the man himself. Let's have a look at his, this is the shack that he lived in. I'll come back to that one later. That's Aldo Leopold in front of his shack. He was a man of many, many different roles. He was a forester. He was an administrator. He did many surveys. He was a member of many committees. At the same time, he was a family man. He had his family of five children and wife. He had very different capacities, but all of them centered around his love and respect for nature, and in particular for wild wilderness areas. The phrase from Thoreau would be just appropriate for Aldo Leopold, that in wildness is the preservation of the world. And I would say he had that particular approach to everything he did. It was always in his mind, both the enjoyment, but also the need to correct our relationship with the land and to adjust that so that, as he concludes in Sant County Almanac, we become part of the community with the land just as much as we are a community with one another, and not a conqueror or somebody who's just taking out of the land. We need to think about how all our relationships. So I think that is beyond those multiple roles that he had. He did inspire changes in his lifetime. And perhaps I just should say some words about Aldo Leopold as a naturalist. He was born in Burlington, Iowa, and his grandfather, both his grandfathers, in fact, came from Germany when they were in their 20s and found their way in the United States. The grandfather on his mother's side, in fact, moved to Burlington, which was then a kind of frontier post in the United States, a ferry across the river and so on. And he settled in as both an architect, engineer, but also as a businessman, and later a civic leader. So he was a leader of the community, and he acquired a large mansion overlooking the Mississippi, surrounded by grounds, with woodlands nearby. It was on limestone bluffs, and there were marshes alongside the river. And this is the area that Aldo Leopold was born into. And as he became older, he helped with the garden, but in particular, both his father and grandfather were keen nature lovers. They were very knowledgeable, and they would take him on walks and guided tours and so on, and explain things to him. And they very quickly captured his enthusiasm for this. And it was an idyllic place for a boy to grow up in. And he became very keen on exploring, on going on the out of doors. And by the time he was 11, he had already become a naturalist who recorded things and looked at details and wondered about things. And he wrote a school essay at the Burlington School. And in that, he said he had found 13 wren's nests in the grounds of where he lived. And he'd also counted and recorded the names of 39 birds. Later on, he went to boarding school, preparing himself to enter the forestry school. But at 16, he claimed and recorded that he identified 239 different birds. And the more he explored, the more details would he record very carefully. And it was this part that of Leopold as a naturalist that went all the way through his life. And the big routine was that what you did was observe, experience, record, understand, and then make sure that you wrote all this up. And he practiced this in detailed journals from the time he was left Burlington right the way through his life, and it became almost the foundation of his life. So he was primarily a naturalist who happened to do all of these other jobs and so on. But his family experience was very good for him. It was a well-to-do family. His grandfather was a very successful businessman. His father ran an office equipment manufacturing company. And every 6 weeks in the year, the family went off to Lake Huron, an island in the Huron, and had a chalet. And Leopold was free to canoe, to go through the woods, to do his recording, to develop and develop. When he went away to boarding school, he had the same experience, that he would go off on his own and then fill multiple pages of letters back home describing exactly what he'd seen. And this is a recording thing. This is a persistent part of his life, that you observe and record, understand, and experience comes before judgments are made. And this one aspect of his life, he describes in the Sand County Almanac, that he would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, make a pot of coffee, go out onto the bench just outside this particular shack that I will come to and describe. And then he would listen to the different bird calls, recording them right the way through until the startup of tractors in the next farm and so on drowned it out. And then he would compare that week by week to see how the dawn chorus developed. So he had this particular characteristic. And I think probably I should just explain that the picture you see is Leopold in front of the Sand County shack. This particular building, in 1935, he'd become a professor of wildlife management at the University of Wisconsin, and he discovered this derelict chicken house on a deserted farm. The farm buildings had been burned down. The farm had been owned by a bootlegger who had fled before he was arrested, and all that was left was this place that Leopold and his family, with the simplest of tools, spent many weekends for 10 years reconstructing and making it a very simple but basic place to enjoy life close to nature. So this is the Sand County Shap, and I think probably just to give another picture of Leopold, I'll give you something else from his background and just give you some idea. Isabel Tree has described Leopold as the pioneer rewilder, that he was so determined that we should live lives richly endowed with wildlife. And as part of that, his start of that, he became a forester in charge of a hardened group of men in 1909, having been to Yale Forestry School. And in the course of that, he describes thinking like a mountain. A deep chesty ball echoes from rim rock to rim rock, rolls down the mountain and fades into the blackness of the night. It is an outburst of wild, defiant sorrow and of contempt for all the adversaries of the world. And he's describing the wolves howling. And then he goes on to go further than that. His conviction that the wolves made their presence known. One day, he saw a wolf die. He was eating his lunch on a high rim rock, at the foot of which a turbulent river elbowed the way. We saw what we thought was a doe fording the torrent, abreast, washed in white water. When she climbed the bank towards us and shook her tail, we realized our error. It was a wolf with half a dozen evidently grown pups, sprang from the willows and all joined in a welcoming melee of wagging tails and playful maulings. What was literally a pile of wolves writhed and tumbled in the center of an open, but at the foot of the rim rock. In those days, we had never heard of passing up a chance to kill a wolf. In a second, we were pumping lead into the pack, but with more excitement than accuracy. How to aim a steep downhill shot is always confusing. When our rifles were empty, the old wolf went down and the pup was dragging a leg into impassable slide rocks. We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then and full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean a hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. And of course, Leopold grew up in a family where hunting was a pastime of both his grandfather and father. And at the age before he was 10, he was given his own gun, but his grandfather instilled into him a very, very rigorous ethic about hunting. And that was that you could only shoot the birds of a particular breed on the wing, and that you should, and on no account, fire them, kill more birds than you needed for your own family use in the pot. And these very strict guidelines were applied, and he followed them all his life. But he was a hunter, and some of the Sand County Almanac, you will hear descriptions of his adventures of shooting quail for breakfast and so on. But on the other hand, from that date in 1909, he started to record it wasn't a road to Damascus and a rapid change at all. It was something that was rather different. It was a gradual awareness growing all the time. And this, he was part of the forest policy, the national forest policy, and different states everywhere in the US were that predators were bad and had to be removed. The more of them were removed, the better the hunting would be and the better for people. But Leopold also had careful notes of what was going on around him. And he noticed that with the removal of predators, the number of deer increased. And as they increased, so the various trees and saplings were reduced. And eventually the deer outnumbered then perhaps their capacity completely, and there would be sudden crashes in population. And he thought this, eventually he realized that this predator control and removal was quite wrong, and that what was needed was some form of habitat management. And he campaigned within the, not really campaigned, he argued within the Forest Service for the next 20 or so years. And then he is even, it's credited, although I haven't fully confirmed that by 1935, he was recommending that wolves, which had almost been eradicated everywhere, should be reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park. And I understand that in 1995, long after the recommendation was made, they did return the wolves to Yellowstone. And it hasn't been exactly straightforward, but they are recognized, and a number of successive generations have lived in the park, and the vegetation has been transformed and the whole environment has been improved because of restoring that chain of the predation, the food chain and so on. The only snag is that the national park itself does not have fixed boundaries that can't be gone over, and the wolves themselves stray over that. And Congress recently has said that wolves are no longer in the endangered list in the States. So anybody can shoot them that wants to, providing they're not in the national park. And one or two of them in the accounts certainly have been shot, but they are still there. And this was particularly an ambition that certainly Leopold had and conformed with him. So this was very important, I think, this fierce green fire outline and how his attitude changed. It was always gradual, it was built up and rarely reversed. So beyond that, we'll just go and have a look at the Almanac. And I'll just read out the Almanac itself. That is where it was largely written. And I think it would give a fair idea, just to give you a sample of his instructions. There are some who can live without wild things, and some who cannot. These essays are the delights and dilemmas of one who cannot. Like winds and sunsets, wild things were taken for granted until progress began to do away with them. Now we face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in things natural, wild and free. For us of the minority, the opportunity to see geese is more important than television, and a chance to find a past flower is a right as inalienable as free speech. These wild things, I admit, have little human value until mechanization assured us of a good breakfast, until science disclosed the drama of where they come from and how they live. The whole conflict, this boils down to a question of degree. We of the minority see a law of diminishing returns to progress. Our opponents do not. So this is and then he concludes, before he starts going into the Sand County Almanac, conservation is getting nowhere because it is incompatible with our Abrahamic concept of land. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. There is no other way for land to survive the impact of mechanized man, nor for us to reap from it the aesthetic harvest it is capable under science of contributing to culture. That land as a community is the basic concept of ecology, but that land is to be loved and respected is an extension of ethics. This land that yields a cultural harvest is that land that yields a cultural harvest is a fact long known, but latterly often forgotten. And he thinks that perhaps we can get a shift of values by reappraising things unnatural, tame, confined in terms of things natural, wild and free, which is what the central part of the Sand County Almanac is. And then we just have having read out the instruction, I can just describe a little bit what is in the Almanac if people aren't familiar with it. Perhaps beginning, I've mentioned how the shack came to be built, but at the other part of the Leopold was that the life his family enjoyed there and craved there was very simple, self-reliant living with very, very simple tools. He thought we've got too many tools and gadgets in our lives, and we can do things better if we do them with reduced equipment and so on. And the first section of the Sand County Almanac is in fact devoted to his experiences and what is recorded when his family went to stay in the shack at weekends. And so there are 12 brief chapters at the start in section 1 of the Sand County Almanac, which go month by month. And some of them are absolutely stunning to read. The particular one I like is The Return of the Geese in the Spring. And that is very poetic, very moving. But the interesting thing is that in each of these chapters, there's usually some kind of phrase which goes a little bit deeper. And he does notice that one of his next door neighbors is an academic, high-powered, and that the start of the goose return, he hears always small honking. This is in the spring, not in the autumn, because they go overhead to a larger lake beyond him. But he hears the honks, and eventually they come from different directions, and the honking becomes loud and thrilling. And the geese are in that particular part of the marsh for about 2 weeks. And then when he talked to his neighbor, he said, "Did you hear the geese?" And she said, "No, didn't notice them." And one of his themes, whether you agree with this or not, he thinks that some formal education can be at the expense of learning how to listen, observe, enjoy nature, and so on. That it's a little bit of too much of one and not enough of the other doesn't lead to a particularly balanced life. So that each of these, as the months go by, he has some little discussion and understanding. And it's noted that he when he observes nature, he talks about the chickadees, which are the American, I think, blue tits and so on. But he rings them. And what he's interested in is not only seeing them, observing them, but understanding what is their range, how long do they live, Where do they nest? How do they relate to one another? So his curiosity needs to be filled in, and he tries to discover this all the way through. So that's the first section of the Sand County Almanac. And then the second section, from which I read that section, the part about the wolf, that is his experiences in work as a forester, and when he's traveled to other parts like Oregon and Manitoba, and they are equally important discussions, but very, very good to read, very pleasant to read. And then finally, the third section, he brings this all together and says, what can we make of all this, and make some judgments of what does it mean for us. And he develops, first of all, what he calls the conservation aesthetic, how people get out of their experiences in these areas. And he notices one thing, although he does less and less hunting as he gets beyond his 40s and so on. And if we don't hunt and get trophies, the camera can give us just as good trophies to take home and to observe, and they do no damage. So he advocates this, and he thinks that we should really try and benefit to learn what we can beyond this. And in particular, he favors, can we persuade people to understand natural history, that he thinks amateurs can contribute an awful lot in terms of natural history by specializing, but equally so, what he calls husbandry is important. So he really thinks we should be pursuing those lines in interesting people and keeping our own knowledge available. So he develops from that particular way people behave, and he quotes the recreation management problems, which we're now on to. I should say that when in the one stage in the before the Grand Canyon became a national park, it was part of the forest district, and Leopold was given the job of recreation management. And at that time, as the motor car had arrived, roads were improved, hordes of people were descending on those areas, and lots of people wanted to put up little shacks to sell food or entertainment and so on. And he thought that should be very much restricted. And he had very strict ideas about the management plan, which was installed and I think formed the basis of what the Grand Canyon has now. So he was knowledgeable about recreation and insisted that we put the emphasis on perception. But as he pursues the arguments in that section 3, he also recognizes the value of ecology. And he had made contact with one of our early ecological scientists, Charles Elton, and they corresponded and met over a period of years. So Leopold thinks that this idea of the food chain and the pyramid and the relationships between different levels and so on is very important and should be the basis of our planning. So the final section brings it all together with his recommendations. And I could probably just quote the end product of it there. He says, "We are remodeling the Alhambra with a steam shovel and are proud of our yardage. We shall hardly relinquish the shovel, which after all has many good points, but we are in need of a gentler and more objective criteria for successful use." So this is the Sand County Almanac, and I shall just briefly go over some of the aspects of his career and how he behaved. Let's, if we can go on, let's, next one, please. Yes, this is it. So this gives us a brief chronology of Aldo Leopold. He was said born in Burlington, Iowa, eldest of 4 children, and eventually he grew up as a naturalist, enjoying the woods, enjoying the river where he skated in winter and canoed in the summer. And round about that time of his childhood, the United States government was setting up its national forests under Gifford Pinchot. And part of his setting up of the national forests and declaring them was also to have a forestry school, and Yale Forest School was established. And by the time he was in his teens, Leopold was ambitious to go to the Yale Forest School, which he did. He joined the US Forest Service in 1909, and that's when he came across the wolf. And it's hard to imagine his first field assignments. It was very hard to get to these areas. These national forests in the Southwest United States, each of them is about half or a third the size of Yorkshire. There are no roads. One of them in the 1909, it took him about 4 days to get anywhere near it. And then it's riding and investigating on horseback and camping out. And his job was surveying, looking at the various management options, taking careful note of everything over a huge area. So they would go off for 2 week, fortnight at a time, and then come back and get something. And his first one was the Apache National Forest, and that is relatively isolated. There is still grazing goes on there, but then he was transferred to Carson National Forest, which is adjacent in New Mexico, and he then started to push his ideas about having the predators and so on. And the course of it also, he married Estella of Santa Fe, and between them they had their 5 children, all of whom would, as I said before, were distinguished conservationists. 3 of them were members of the National Academy of Science. And so there was a great deal of environmental investigation going on between them. And eventually he submitted his proposals for a national forest as a wilderness area. I think it has some of it designated, and one area now is known as the Leopold Wilderness Area. So he had a serious illness in the course of this, which held him back, but put him into the main office. So he did an awful lot of administration. And eventually he was very successful in getting promoted. And he was promoted to the research laboratory in Wisconsin, which he didn't enjoy a great deal. It was too much indoors, I think. He still continued as, in fact, assessing the outside world and so on. And he left the laboratory and went to work for one of the game associations, doing surveys of as a private consultant. But by 1933, he had been appointed to a new chair of game management in the Department of Agricultural Economics at the University of Wisconsin. And 1935, he acquired the farm, the shack, that would be the setting for all his essays there. And eventually he became not the game manager, but the chair of the new Department of Wildlife Management at the University of Wisconsin. He had a whole approach to education that it involved for the graduate students, not just field visits and so on, but actual field work and field practice. And this, I think, probably is part of his philosophy, that you combine both what goes on inside the sciences in laboratories and elsewhere, but also what goes on outside, and you put these together. He submitted his book to Oxford University Press in 1947, and then 1948, the fire on his neighbour's farm, he went to help out, and in fact died of a heart attack. The book itself was edited by Luna and published in 1949. So that is probably a summary of his career. It was a very busy life, and I could say that he, in addition to write just a slim volume, the book, but in an enormous number of journal articles, proposals, committee papers, absolutely a great torrent of them throughout his life. Very, very busy man, very well ordered, but also thoroughly enjoying his contact with nature. Yes.
Thank you, Jim. That was a lovely run through the life of a man who was clearly very wise and arguably ahead of his time. I'd invite people to put any questions into the Q&A section.
Jim, sorry.
If I can hear them, you can
Yeah.
interpret for me.
Okay. So people do that, Jim. I have a question. If Leopold was around today and invited to update his almanac, how much do you think he would change?
Yeah, if Aldo Leopold was around today and he was invited to update the almanac, what might he change?
In his book, you mean?
Well, what would,
Yes.
yes.
I think he would still keep on the same tracks, but I think he would have a greater urgency about curtailing consumption. In the Sand County, he said, yes, we should prefer, there's something to be said for watching birds rather than sitting in with television, and he'd be much more horrified. And I should say that I don't know if you've read Dave Goulson's Silent Earth, but we tend to think we're doing a lot of good things in primary schools, in education, in the interpretation we've got in national parks and so on. But on the other hand, Dave Goulson describes in his book, the latest one, first-year university students studying ecology. He takes them round the university grounds. They cannot recognize sycamore or oak, and these are students going to do ecology. They cannot recognize the difference between crows and blackbirds. That's 50% of them at least. He says they are woefully deficient. Whether it's because people spend too much screen time, he will be much more vigorous in his arguments, I think, saying we've got we're doing our best, we've got lots of initiatives, but we need to get people more occupied and both enjoying and understanding the natural world around them. That's what I think. I'm not sure how he would react to climate change, to biodiversity itself, but I think some aspects of it are long-standing that still survive from the Sand County. Yeah.
Certainly. Thanks for that, Jim. I'm told my sound is a bit fuzzy. I don't try and change anything just now, but Jim, what do you feel is Leopold's legacy in terms of modern day conservation in the USA?
Yeah, what's Leopold's legacy in terms of conservation in the USA?
Yes, I certainly think 1935, I should have mentioned that, he became president of the Wilderness Society. So I think the wilderness areas that have been set up in the States are very much part of his legacy. I mean, he worked with other people, both people who are very much stricter than he was on that, but he also was very keen that appropriate legislation, he thought it should go in two directions. One, from communities and individual people upwards, but also that government should do things. And his philosophy was one that he thinks that some of the things which are abusing the environment, people do as of right, and then they expect a subsidy from government to stop doing it. And he thought that was the wrong approach. in the 1930s. There'd been the New Deal and so on. And some of the conservation courts were doing that, but he thought that people should take a responsibility themselves and get help for certain projects and so on. But I think that's, that side is still debatable. He debated the role of economics and conservation in the 1930s, and some of those arguments are still around today and not resolved.
Thanks, Jim. Well, given my sound is a bit iffy, I'll pass back to Helen to sum up, just with a note that I'll definitely be going back and rereading the Almanac. It's a while since I did, but I knew a lot less about rewilding then than I do now. Helen.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And thank you very much, Jim, for what I'm sure everyone will agree. It's been a fantastic talk. I have to confess, I haven't read the Sand County Almanac, but I will do it now, because the passages that you read out were so moving, so thought-provoking, so lovely. Clearly, he's a poet as well as an ecologist. I think you've probably inspired many of us to go away and look out the Sand County Almanac. I wonder, thinking of him there in 1948-49, whether he could really have predicted just how far mechanized man would go in the desperation of the planet. I suspect he couldn't quite have seen at that stage just how dreadful the situation might become. But I think all the more need for the recipes that he recommended, in particular, observation, recording, and inspiring the young with nature, as indeed it looks as though he was inspired by those grandfathers who took him out into the wild and showed him things, named them. And we can all do a bit of that ourselves if we have grandchildren, or even if we don't. It's possible to volunteer for organisations like the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and so on, whose mission it is to try to inculcate those same loves of nature in young children in our present day. So thank you very much, Jim, for an extremely informative and, as I said, in places poetic talk. It was really lovely to hear those extracts. Thank you. Just before we finally finish, let me remind you about the next talk, which I think is in a fortnight's time, the usual spacing at the moment between talks. I think that will be, I wrote it down somewhere, where did I write it? 26, yes, the 26th of October, that will be, and it will be Rachel Bice, who is going to be talking to us. Oh, okay, here's the slide is on the screen. She's the Chief Executive of the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, and this is the delayed event that we weren't able to have last year when it was our 75th anniversary. But we're having it this year instead, so all is not lost. So please do remember to come. I'm sure that will be a really great talk, and we'll find out a lot of things we don't know about our local area. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and I hope I'll see you next time. And thank you again, Jim.